The words still echo in my mind like a death sentence delivered with a smile. Mom, we think you're losing your mind. Maybe it's time we helped you manage your affairs before you do something you'll regret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I thought I had seen every shade of betrayal life could paint. I was wrong. The deepest cuts always come from the hands that once held yours while crossing the street. It started on a Tuesday morning in October, when the maple trees outside my Victorian home in Salem, Oregon were just beginning their annual transformation. I had been living in this house for 47 years, ever since my late husband David and I bought it, as newlyweds with dreams bigger than our bank account. The mortgage payments had been steep back then, but we managed through David's work at the lumber mill and my job as a school secretary. Every room held memories we had built together. Every creaking floorboard told a story of children running through hallways, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings that seemed to last forever. David passed away 8 years ago from a sudden heart attack that left me reeling in ways I never expected. The grief was suffocating at first, but slowly I learned to navigate this house alone, to make decisions without consulting anyone, to find peace in solitude that I had never known existed. My children, Rebecca and Michael, had been supportive during the immediate aftermath of their father's death, helping with funeral arrangements and the overwhelming paperwork that death leaves in its wake. But as months turned to years, their concerns seemed to shift from my emotional well-being to something far more calculating. Rebecca, my eldest at 48, worked as a real estate agent in Portland. She had always been ambitious, the type of child who organized lemonade stands with detailed business plans and profit projections. Michael, 3 years younger, managed a struggling auto repair shop and had a tendency to see dollar signs where others saw family heirloom. Both had inherited David's sharp mind for numbers, but somewhere along the way they had lost his gentle heart. The house David and I built our life in sat on 3 acres of prime real estate that had appreciated dramatically over the decade. What we had purchased for $48,000 in 1976 was now worth close to $1.2 million according to the property assessments that arrived each year. The land itself was worth a fortune, situated just outside the city limits where developers circled like vultures, eager to transform family properties into subdivision gold mines. I had always known the house was valuable, but I never really considered it an asset to be liquidated. It was my home, my sanctuary, the place where I felt closest to David's memory. Every morning I made coffee in the same kitchen where he used to read me funny excerpts from the newspaper. Every evening I sat in the living room where we had watched our children take their first steps, where we had argued about politics and dreamed about retirement trips we would never take. The first hint that my children viewed my independence as problematic came during a family dinner in late September. Rebecca had suggested we all get together to discuss family matters, which should have been my first warning. She arrived with manila folders and printed spreadsheets, while Michael brought his wife Sandra, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Over my homemade pot roast, Rebecca launched into what she called a practical conversation about the future. She spoke about my advancing age as though I were not sitting right across from her, discussing my cognitive decline and financial vulnerability with the clinical detachment of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. Michael nodded along, occasionally interjecting with concerns about my ability to maintain such a large property alone. They painted a picture of an elderly woman teetering on the edge of incompetence, someone who needed to be saved from her own poor judgment. Rebecca had even researched assisted living facilities in the area, complete with glossy brochures featuring smiling seniors playing checkers in sterile common rooms. The message was clear: I was too old, too frail, and too mentally diminished to be trusted with my own life decisions. What struck me most was how they talked around me rather than to me, as though my presence at my own intervention was merely a formality. They had decided that I was declining, that my judgment was compromised, that they needed to step in before I made mistakes that would affect their inheritance. The irony was not lost on me that they were questioning my mental capacity while simultaneously planning how to spend my money. I listened without arguing that night, partly because I was too shocked to formulate a response and partly because I wanted to see how far they would take their intervention. By the end of the evening, They had presented me with business cards for elder law attorneys, financial planners who specialized in senior protection, and moving companies that could help me downsize to something more manageable. Rebecca suggested that I consider signing power of attorney documents that would allow them to help manage my finances and medical decisions. She framed it as a safety net, a way to ensure that I would be protected if my health declined. Michael emphasized how much stress it would take off my shoulders, how I could finally relax and let them handle the complicated aspects of property ownership and investment management. Their concern felt rehearsed, like a presentation they had practiced in anticipation of my resistance. When I asked questions about specifics, they deflected with vague reassurances about wanting what was best for me. When I mentioned that I felt perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, they exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of my self-assessment. The evening ended with them leaving behind a stack of documents for me to review when I was ready, as though my readiness was inevitable rather than optional. I watched their taillights disappear down my driveway and felt something shift inside me, a recognition that the people I had raised and loved unconditionally now saw me as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a person to respect. Over the following weeks, their campaign intensified. Rebecca would call daily under the guise of checking on me, but her conversations always circled back to my living situation and financial management. She would mention news stories about elderly people being taken advantage of by scammers, about seniors who had fallen and been unable to get help, about the dangers of living alone in such an isolated location. Michael took a different approach, focusing on the practical burdens of homeownership. He would arrive unannounced to point out maintenance issues that needed attention, from loose gutters to cracked sidewalks that could pose safety hazards. He spoke about the enormous expense of keeping up such a large property, about property taxes that continued to rise, about the wisdom of liquidating real estate while the market was strong. Both of them began to frame my attachment to the house as sentimental foolishness rather than reasonable preference. They spoke about my stubbornness and my inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Rebecca even suggested that my reluctance to consider their advice was itself evidence of cognitive decline, a classic sign of elderly people becoming rigid and unable to process new information rationally. Their persistence wore me down in ways I had not anticipated. They made me question my own perceptions, wonder if perhaps they were seeing something I was missing. Was I being unreasonable? Was my desire to remain in my own home really just stubborn denial of reality? The doubt they planted grew like weeds in my mind, choking out my natural confidence in my own judgment. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in early November when both children arrived at my house with a surprise guest. Dr. Harrison was a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in cognitive assessments for older adults. Rebecca had scheduled an appointment without my knowledge or consent, framing it as a routine wellness check that was supposedly recommended for all seniors my age. Dr. Harrison was professional and kind, but his presence felt like an ambush. He asked me questions about my daily routines, my memory, my ability to manage complex tasks. He had me perform simple cognitive tests, draw clocks, remember word lists, solve basic math problems. Throughout the evaluation, Rebecca and Michael sat in my living room like prosecutors building their case, occasionally offering examples of my supposed confusion or forgetfulness. They told Dr. Harrison about times I had repeated stories, instances when I had misplaced my keys, occasions when I had seemed confused about dates or appointments. They painted a picture of progressive decline that felt foreign to my own experience of my life. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that everyone repeats stories sometimes, that misplacing keys is not a sign of dementia, that being occasionally confused about dates is normal human behavior rather than pathological decline. But sitting in that sterile evaluation, surrounded by people who claimed to love me while simultaneously undermining my autonomy, I felt my confidence crumble. Maybe they were right, maybe I was losing my grip on reality. Maybe my perception of my own competence was itself a symptom of the very decline they were trying to address. Dr. Harrison concluded that while I showed some normal age-related changes in memory and processing speed, there was no evidence of significant cognitive impairment or dementia. His assessment should have vindicated me, should have put an end to my children's intervention. Instead, Rebecca questioned whether one evaluation was sufficient, whether a second opinion might be valuable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Whether we should monitor the situation more closely over time. After Harrison left, my children sat me down for what they called a necessary conversation about next steps. They acknowledged that psychiatric evaluation had been reassuring, but they maintained that living alone in such a large house was still inadvisable for someone my age. They presented their concerns as loving protection rather than controlling manipulation. Rebecca had prepared a comprehensive plan for my transition to assisted living. She had toured facilities, compared costs, and identified what she considered the best option for my needs. The Sunset Manor was a high-end senior community with independent living apartments, assisted care services, and memory care units for residents whose needs increased over time. She described it as a place where I could make friends, participate in activities, and receive support without sacrificing my independence. Michael focused on the financial aspects of the transition. He had calculated the costs of selling the house, the proceeds that would be available for my care, and the monthly expenses of living at Sunset Manor. According to his projections, the sale of my property would fund my care for the rest of my life with money left over for them to inherit. He presented these calculations as though he were doing me a favor, helping me maximize my financial security rather than planning how to access my wealth. Their presentation was thorough and seemingly logical. They had thought through every objection I might raise and prepared responses that made my resistance seem irrational. When I said I loved my house, they reminded me that attachment to possessions was unhealthy at my age. When I mentioned my independence, they pointed out that true independence meant accepting help when it was needed. When I expressed concern about leaving my memories behind, they assured me that memories lived in my heart rather than in rooms and furniture. The most insidious part of their argument was how they framed their own motivations. They claimed to want nothing for themselves, to be concerned only with my well-being and happiness. They spoke about their sleepless nights worrying about my safety, their guilt about living too far away to help if something happened, their sense of responsibility as loving children who wanted to honor their father's memory by taking care of me. But I could see through their altruistic language to the calculations underneath. Rebecca had already contacted real estate agents about listing my property. Michael had researched the most advantageous ways to transfer assets to minimize tax implications. They had discussed among themselves how to divide the proceeds from my house sale, how to manage my investments, how to ensure that their inheritance remained intact. That night, after they finally left me alone with their folders and brochures and guilt-inducing expressions of concern, I sat in David's old recliner and tried to make sense of what was happening to my life. The people I had sacrificed for, worried about, and loved unconditionally were systematically dismantling my autonomy under the guise of protection. They were erasing my voice from decisions about my own future while claiming to act in my best interest. I thought about the years I had spent raising them, the countless nights I had stayed up when they were sick, the college tuition I had helped pay, the down payments I had contributed for their first home. I remembered the pride I had felt watching them grow into successful adults, the joy of becoming a grandmother, the satisfaction of knowing that David and I had raised children who would carry our values forward into the world. But somewhere along the way, those children had become strangers who saw me as a liability rather than a person. They had learned to speak the language of love while practicing the arithmetic of grief. They had convinced themselves that their desire for my assets was actually concern for my welfare, that their need to control my choices was really about protecting me from my own limitations. The realization that my own children viewed me as an impediment to their financial security, rather than a mother deserving of respect, was more painful than David's death had been. Grief over loss is natural and healing, but betrayal by the people you trust most leaves wounds that fester rather than heal. I felt like I was mourning the children I thought I had raised while being terrorized by the strangers they had become. That was the night I decided to stop being a victim of their manipulation and start being the architect of my own future. I had spent 8 years learning to live without David's partnership, and now I needed to learn to live without my children's approval. The house that they saw as real estate to be liquidated was my home, my sanctuary, my connection to a lifetime of memories that no assisted living facility could replace. I was not losing my mind, despite their campaigns to convince me otherwise. I was not too frail to live independently, despite their catalog of supposed safety concerns. I was not too confused to manage my own finances, despite their offers to relieve me of that burden. What I was losing was my tolerance for being treated like a child by the children I had raised to be better than this. The next morning I called my longtime attorney, Patricia Williams, and scheduled an appointment to review my estate planning document. Patricia had handled David's will and had been updating my legal documents for years. She knew me as a competent, thoughtful woman who made careful decisions after thorough consideration. If anyone could help me understand my options and protect my interests, it would be Patricia. I also made an appointment with my family doctor, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, for a complete physical and cognitive assessment. If my children were going to question my mental capacity, I wanted independent medical documentation of my competence. I was not going to let their accusations go unchallenged, especially when those accusations were being used to justify taking control of my life. Most importantly, I began to document everything. I started keeping detailed records of every conversation with Rebecca and Michael, every suggestion they made, every pressure tactic they employed. I saved their emails and text messages, kept copies of the documents they had given me, and wrote down my own thoughts and feelings about their intervention attempts. I was building a case, not for a court of law but for the court of my own conscience. I needed to prove to myself that I was not the confused, declining elderly woman they were painting me to be. I needed evidence that their concern was really control, that their love was really greed, that their protection was really manipulation. The more I documented their behavior, the clearer their pattern became. They were not responding to any real crisis or emergency in my life. There had been no incident that triggered their sudden concern about my cognitive abilities or living situation. Instead, their intervention had begun shortly after the property tax assessment arrived, showing the increased value of my house and land. Rebecca had started researching real estate values in my area around the same time she began expressing concerns about my independence. Michael had contacted financial planners about managing inherited assets, just weeks before he started pointing out maintenance issues with my property. Their timing revealed their true motivations more clearly than their words ever could. I realized that I had been grieving the wrong loss. I had been mourning my children's apparent lack of concern for my well-being when I should have been mourning my illusions about their character. They were not suddenly becoming greedy and manipulative. They were revealing aspects of themselves that had probably always existed but had been hidden while they needed my support and approval. The children I thought I had raised with strong moral foundations had instead learned to disguise self-interest as altruism, to frame exploitation as protection, to justify manipulation as love. They had become skilled at saying the right words while pursuing the wrong goals, at expressing the appropriate emotions while calculating the most advantageous outcomes. This recognition was liberating in ways I had not expected. Once I stopped trying to reconcile their caring words with their controlling actions, I could see their behavior clearly and respond accordingly. I was not obligated to submit to their interventions simply because they were my children. I was not required to sacrifice my autonomy to validate their concern. I was not responsible for protecting their inheritance at the expense of my own happiness. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. The doubt and confusion they had planted in my mind began to clear, replaced by the clarity that comes from understanding a situation accurately, rather than hopefully. I was not losing my mind, I was finding my resolve, and that resolve was going to change everything. 3 weeks after my revelation, I walked into Patricia Williams' law office with a purpose that surprised even me. The familiar smell of leather-bound books and old wood polish filled the reception area, where I had sat many times over the years discussing wills, property transfers, and the mundane legal details that accumulate over a lifetime. But this visit felt different. This time I was not seeking advice about routine matters, I was preparing for war. Patricia greeted me with the warm smile I remembered from our decades of professional relationship. She was nearing retirement herself, a woman in her late 60s, who had built her practice on serving families through their most difficult transition. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her sharp blue eyes held the intelligence that had made her one of the most respected estate attorneys in the county. We settled into her office where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held volumes of legal precedents and family law statutes. Patricia poured tea from a delicate china service that had belonged to her grandmother, a ritual that always preceded our most serious conversations. She sensed the gravity of my visit before I spoke a single word. I began by explaining the situation with Rebecca and Michael, detailing their systematic campaign to undermine my independence and force me into assisted living. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as I described the psychiatric evaluation ambush and their attempts to convince me that I was mentally declining. When I finished my account, Patricia set down her pen and looked at me direct. She had known me for over 20 years, had witnessed my competence in handling David's estate, and had observed my careful decision-making process during our numerous consultations. Her assessment of my mental capacity carried far more weight than my children's accusation. Patricia explained that what Rebecca and Michael were attempting was a form of elder abuse, specifically financial exploitation disguised as concern. She had seen similar cases throughout her career, where adult children convinced themselves that their parents were incompetent in order to justify taking control of valuable assets. The fact that they had arranged a psychiatric evaluation without my informed consent was particularly troubling from a legal standpoint. She reviewed my existing estate planning documents, which had been carefully crafted to reflect my wishes for asset distribution after my death. My will left the house, and most of my assets to be divided equally between Rebecca and Michael, with smaller bequests to my grandchildren, several charities I supported. Patricia pointed out that these documents could be modified at any time, as long as I remained mentally competent to make such decisions. The conversation that followed changed the trajectory of my life in ways I could never have imagined. Patricia explained that I had far more control over my situation than my children wanted me to believe. They could not force me into assisted living without a court order, declaring me incompetent, which would require clear medical evidence of cognitive decline that simply did not exist. They could not take control of my finances without legal authority that I would have to grant them voluntarily. More importantly, Patricia reminded me that my estate planning documents were not contracts that bound me to specific asset distribution. I could modify my will at any time to reflect changes in my circumstances or relationships. If my children were treating me poorly while I was alive, I was under no obligation to reward that behavior with generous inheritances after my death. This revelation hit me like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. I had been operating under the assumption that my will was set in stone, that my children's inheritance was guaranteed regardless of how they treated me. Patricia's explanation freed me from that misconception and opened up possibilities I had never considered. We spent the next 2 hours discussing various options for protecting my assets and my autonomy. Patricia suggested establishing a revocable trust that would allow me to maintain complete control over my property while making it more difficult for others to challenge my decision. She also recommended updating my power of attorney documents to specify exactly when and how they could be activated, preventing my children from claiming authority they had not been explicitly granted. Most significantly, Patricia helped me understand that I could use my estate planning as a tool for setting boundaries with my children. If they continued to treat me as incompetent and try to control my life, I could reduce or eliminate their inheritances in favor of beneficiaries who respected my autonomy. The knowledge that their financial future depended on their treatment of me might motivate them to reconsider their current approach. I left Patricia's office with a folder full of documents to review and a sense of empowerment I had not felt in months. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I had agency in my own life, rather than being a passive victim of my children's machinations. The law was on my side, and I had an experienced advocate who understood exactly what I was facing. My next stop was Dr. Martinez's office for the comprehensive evaluation I had scheduled. Dr. Martinez had been my physician for 15 years, and knew my medical history better than anyone. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had earned my trust through her competent care and honest communication about my health status. The evaluation was thorough and objective, covering not just my physical health but my cognitive function, emotional stability and ability to live independently. Dr. Martinez administered standardized tests for memory, reasoning, and decision-making capacity. She reviewed my medications, assessed my nutritional status, and evaluated my balance and mobility. The results were exactly what I had expected but needed documented. I was in excellent health for my age, with no signs of dementia, depression, or other conditions that would impair my judgment. My cognitive test scores were well within normal ranges for someone my age, and my ability to manage complex tasks remained intact. Dr. Martinez noted in my medical record that I showed no evidence of the cognitive decline my children had claimed to observe. More importantly, Dr. Martinez was outraged when I described the psychiatric evaluation that Rebecca and Michael had arranged without my consent. She explained that such evaluations should only be conducted with the patient's informed agreement or under court order when there was genuine concern about competence. The fact that my children had essentially tricked me into submitting to psychological testing was ethically problematic and potentially legally actionable. Martinez provided me with written documentation of my competency, including detailed test results and her professional assessment of my cognitive abilities. This medical evidence would be crucial if my children attempted to challenge my mental capacity in legal proceedings. She also agreed to serve as an expert witness if needed to defend my right to make my own decisions about my living situation and financial affairs. Armed with legal and medical validation of my competence, I returned home feeling stronger than I had in months. The doubt and confusion my children had planted in my mind had been replaced by objective evidence of my capabilities. I was not the declining elderly woman they had portrayed. I was a competent adult who deserved to be treated with respect rather than manipulated through false concern. That evening, I began implementing the first phase of my plan to reclaim control over my life. I called the bank and updated my account information, removing Rebecca and Michael as emergency contacts and adding Patricia Williams instead. I changed the passwords on all my online accounts and enabled two-factor authentication to prevent unauthorized access. I also opened a new savings account that only I could access, transferring a significant portion of my liquid assets to protect them from any future manipulation attempt. The next morning brought an unexpected test of my newfound resolve. Rebecca arrived at my house unannounced, carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing the concerned expression she had perfected over the past few months. She claimed to be checking on me after our last conversation, but her true purpose became clear when she began asking pointed questions about my recent activities. Rebecca had somehow learned about my visits to Patricia's office and Dr. Martinez's clinic. She questioned why I felt the need to consult with professionals about my situation, suggesting that such behavior indicated paranoia or confusion about my family's motives. She tried to frame my defensive actions as evidence of the very cognitive decline she had been claiming to observe. The conversation that followed marked a turning point in our relationship. Instead of allowing Rebecca to gaslight me with her false concerns, I confronted her directly about her manipulative behavior. I told her that I knew exactly what she and Michael were trying to accomplish, that I understood their apparent concern was really about controlling my assets, and that I would not tolerate being treated like an incompetent child any longer. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her mask of loving concern slipped away, replaced by anger and frustration that I was not cooperating with her plans. She accused me of being influenced by outsiders who did not understand our family dynamic. She claimed that Patricia Williams was taking advantage of my vulnerability to generate legal fees, and that Dr. Martinez was enabling my delusions of independence. When I remained firm in my position, Rebecca escalated to emotional manipulation. She began crying, claiming that she was only trying to protect me because she loved me so much. She spoke about her fears of losing me, her guilt about living too far away to help, and her sense of responsibility as my daughter to ensure my safety and well-being. But I had learned to recognize the difference between genuine emotion and calculated performance. Rebecca's tears felt rehearsed, her expressions of love felt conditional, and her claims of protection felt like threats disguised as promises. She was not crying because she was worried about me. She was crying because I was refusing to submit to her control. The conversation ended with Rebecca storming out of my house, but not before delivering a parting threat that revealed her true intention. She told me that if I continued to resist their reasonable suggestions, she and Michael would have no choice but to pursue legal guardianship to protect me from my own poor judgment. She claimed that my refusal to accept help was itself evidence of diminished capacity that would support their petition for authority over my affairs. After she left, I sat in my kitchen and processed what had just occurred. My daughter had essentially threatened to have me declared incompetent if I did not voluntarily surrender my autonomy. The loving concern she had expressed for months was revealed to be coercive manipulation, designed to pressure me into compliance. She was not trying to protect me, she was trying to control me. That afternoon, I called Patricia Williams and scheduled an emergency consultation to discuss Rebecca's threats. Patricia explained that guardianship proceedings were complex legal processes that required clear evidence of incapacity. The medical and psychological evaluations I had undergone would make it extremely difficult for my children to prove that I was unable to care for myself or manage my affairs. However, Patricia also warned me that guardianship challenges could be emotionally devastating and financially expensive, even when they were ultimately unsuccessful. My children could force me to defend my competency in court, subjecting me to invasive scrutiny and public humiliation regardless of the outcome. The threat itself was a form of abuse, designed to frighten me into submission rather than actually protect my well-being. Patricia recommended that we accelerate our estate planning modifications to protect my assets from any potential legal challenges. She suggested establishing an irrevocable trust that would remove my house and other valuable assets from my direct ownership, making them unavailable to my children even if they somehow gained guardianship over me. This strategy would require careful consideration of tax implications and long-term care planning, but it would effectively shield my wealth from their manipulation attempts. We also discussed the possibility of pursuing a restraining order against Rebecca and Michael if their harassment continued to escalate. Their threats of forced guardianship could constitute elder abuse under Oregon law, and I had the right to legal protection from their intimidation tactics. Patricia assured me that I did not have to endure their psychological warfare simply because they were my children. Over the following days, I found myself viewing my situation with increasing clarity. The people I had raised and loved were revealed to be strangers, who saw me as an obstacle to their financial goals rather than a person deserving of respect. They had learned to speak the language of love, while practicing the arithmetic of greed, convinced themselves that their desire for my assets was actually concern for my welfare. Michael called later that week attempting a different approach than his sister had used. He was calm and rational, speaking in the measured tones of someone trying to negotiate a business deal. He explained that he had spoken with Rebecca about their conversation and understood that I felt pressured by their suggestion. He wanted to find a compromise that would address everyone's concerns while respecting my independence. His proposal was sophisticated in its manipulation. Instead of forcing me into assisted living immediately, he suggested that I consider allowing them to help manage my property maintenance and financial plan. They could hire contractors to handle repairs and upkeep, freeing me from the burden of dealing with service providers and ensuring that everything was properly maintained. They could also work with financial advisors to optimize my investments and plan for potential long-term care needs. Michael framed these suggestions as services rather than takeovers, ways to support my independence rather than undermine it. He spoke about wanting to honor my desire to remain in my home while ensuring that I had adequate support systems in place. He even offered to pay for these services themselves, presenting their financial assistance as evidence of their genuine concern for my welfare. But I could see through his reasonable facade to the control mechanisms underneath. If I allowed them to manage my property maintenance, they would have access to my house and information about its condition and value. If I gave them authority over my financial planning, they would gain insight into my assets and the ability to influence my spending decisions. What Michael was proposing was not support, but gradual takeover of my affairs disguised as helpful assistance. I declined his offer politely but firmly, explaining that I was perfectly capable of managing my own property and finances. Michael's response revealed his true feelings about my autonomy. He became frustrated and condescending, suggesting that my refusal to accept help was evidence of the stubbornness and poor judgment that elderly people often developed. He implied that my independence was really isolation, that my self-reliance was really denial of my limitations. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Michael accused me of being ungrateful for their concern and selfish in my refusal to consider their feelings. He claimed that my behavior was causing stress for the entire family, that my grandchildren were worried about me, and that my stubbornness was damaging relationships that had taken decades to build. When I pointed out that I had never asked for their intervention, and had repeatedly expressed my satisfaction with my current living situation, Michael became openly hostile. He told me that adult children had responsibilities to aging parents, just as parents had responsibilities to minor children. He suggested that my inability to recognize my own limitations was exactly the kind of cognitive decline that required family intervention. The call ended with Michael hanging up on me, but not before delivering his own version of Rebecca's threat. He told me that if I continued to reject their reasonable attempts to help, they would have no choice but to pursue more formal measures to ensure my safety. He spoke about their duty to protect me from my own poor judgment, even if that meant overriding my expressed preferences. After the call, I realized that both of my children had now threatened me with forced guardianship if I did not submit to their control. They were not concerned about my well-being. They were frustrated by my resistance to their manipulation. The mask of loving concern had been completely discarded, replaced by open coercion and intimidation. That evening I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I called Patricia Williams and instructed her to begin drafting a new will that would dramatically reduce Rebecca and Michael's inheritance. If they were going to treat me like an incompetent obstacle to their financial goals, they would discover that their behavior had consequences that extended beyond my lifetime. I also authorized Patricia to establish the irrevocable trust we had discussed, transferring my house and most of my valuable assets into a legal structure that would protect them from any future guardianship proceeding. The trust would allow me to remain in my home for the rest of my life while ensuring that my children could not access these assets, even if they somehow gained legal authority over my affairs. Most importantly, I decided to redirect the bulk of my estate to organizations and individuals who had treated me with respect rather than manipulation. I increased my bequests to several charities I supported, established scholarships at the local high school where I had worked for many years, and created a fund to support elderly people facing financial abuse from their family. The knowledge that I was taking concrete action to protect myself and my assets provided a sense of empowerment I had not experienced since this ordeal began. I was no longer a passive victim of my children's schemes. I was an active participant in determining my own future. They had forced me to choose between my family relationships and my autonomy, and I had chosen myself. Over the next few weeks, I implemented additional protective measures suggested by Patricia. I hired a property management company to handle routine maintenance and repairs, removing any justification my children might claim for needing access to my house. I also engaged a financial advisor who specialized in elder care planning to optimize my investments and ensure that my resources would last for the rest of my life, regardless of what care I might eventually need. These professional relationships provided me with expert support while maintaining my independence and decision-making authority. Unlike my children's offers of help, these services were transparent about their costs and limitations. They advised me about my options without trying to manipulate my choices, respected my preferences without questioning my competence, and supported my goals without serving their own hidden agendas. The transformation in my daily life was remarkable. Without the constant stress of my children's manipulation attempts, I found myself enjoying activities and relationships that I had been too distracted to appreciate. I reconnected with old friends who had drifted away during my period of self-doubt, joined community organizations that welcomed my participation, and rediscovered interests that had been dormant during my years of grief and confusion. I also began documenting my experience with elder abuse, keeping detailed records of my children's behavior and my responses to their manipulation. Patricia suggested that this documentation might be valuable for other elderly people facing similar situations, and potentially for training professionals who worked with families in crisis. My personal ordeal could serve a larger purpose if it helped others recognize and resist similar forms of exploitation. The peace I found during this period was interrupted by an unexpected escalation from Rebecca and Mike. They had apparently consulted with their own attorney about pursuing guardianship proceedings, and had been advised that their case was weak without stronger evidence of my incapacity. Their response was to manufacture such evidence through a coordinated campaign of sabotage and documentation. Rebecca began visiting my neighbors, expressing concern about my mental state, and asking them to report any unusual behaviors they might observe. She told them that the family was worried about my safety and judgment, and requested that they contact her if they noticed anything concerning about my activities or appearance. She was essentially recruiting witnesses who might testify about my supposed decline if guardianship proceedings moved forward. Michael took a more direct approach, attempting to create situations that would make me appear confused or incompetent. He showed up at my house with repair estimates for work that did not need to be done, then expressed concern when I refused to authorize unnecessary expenses. He called my doctor's offices, claiming to be worried about my medical compliance, trying to gather information that might suggest I was not managing my health appropriately. Most insidiously, both children began spreading rumors within our extended family and social circle about my mental deterioration. They spoke sadly about my personality changes, my suspicious behavior, and my refusal to accept help from people who loved her. They portrayed themselves as devoted children struggling to care for a parent who was no longer rational or cooperative. This campaign of character assassination was perhaps the most painful aspect of their abuse. They were not just trying to control my assets, they were destroying my reputation and relationships in service of their goal. People I had known for decades began treating me with the cautious concern typically reserved for those who were mentally fragile, and I realized that my children's whisper campaign was succeeding in isolating me from my support network. The breaking point came when I discovered that Rebecca had contacted my church, claiming that I had been making concerning statements about giving away all my money and needed pastoral counseling for my own protection. Pastor Williams, who had known me for over 30 years, was confused by this report because I had shown no signs of mental distress during our regular interactions. His call to check on me revealed the extent of my children's deception and the sophistication of their manipulation campaign. That conversation with Pastor Williams crystallized my understanding of what I was facing. My children were not misguided but loving family members who were concerned about my welfare. They were calculating manipulators who were willing to destroy my social connections to achieve their financial goal. They had moved beyond intimidation and threats to active sabotage of my relationships and reputation. I realized that I could no longer afford to be reactive in dealing with their abuse. Defending myself against their accusations and protecting my assets from their schemes was not sufficient. I needed to go on the offense to stop their campaign before it destroyed everything I had built over my lifetime. The time for hoping they would come to their senses had passed. Now I needed to demonstrate that their behavior would have serious consequences they had not anticipated. The next phase of my response would require courage I was not sure I possessed, and actions that would permanently alter my relationships with my children. But I had learned that preserving toxic family connections was not worth sacrificing my dignity, autonomy, and peace of mind. Sometimes protecting yourself required burning bridges that others had already soaked in gasoline. The morning I decided to stop being a victim marked the beginning of the most challenging and liberating period of my life. I woke before dawn, on a crisp December morning, with absolute clarity about what needed to be done. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that my children had deliberately created had finally lifted, revealing a landscape of manipulation and greed that I could no longer ignore or tolerate. My first call was to Patricia Williams. Despite the early hour, I knew she would understand the urgency when I explained that Rebecca and Michael had escalated their campaign to include character assassination and witness recruitment. Patricia listened grimly as I described their attempts to portray me as mentally unstable to my neighbors, church community, and medical providers. Patricia's response was swift and decisive. She explained that my children's behavior had crossed several legal lines, moving from family manipulation into territory that could be prosecuted as elder abuse under Oregon law. Their attempts to interfere with my medical care, spread false information about my mental state, and recruit witnesses for potential guardianship proceedings constituted harassment and potentially fraud. Within 2 hours, Patricia had prepared cease and desist letters for both Rebecca and Michael, formally demanding that they stop their campaign of harassment and misinformation. The letters detailed their specific actions, explained the legal consequences of continued abuse, and put them on notice that further interference would result in criminal charges and civil litigation. More importantly, Patricia had accelerated the timeline for establishing my protective legal structures. By the end of that week, my irrevocable trust would be finalized, my new will would be executed, and my assets would be safely shielded from any future manipulation attempt. My children would discover that their campaign to gain control over my wealth had actually resulted in them losing access to it entirely. The trust document was a masterpiece of protective planning. It transferred ownership of my house and most of my valuable assets to a legal entity that I controlled during my lifetime, but that could not be touched by guardianship proceedings or other legal challenges. The trust also included detailed provisions for my care, if I ever became truly incapacitated, appointing professional trustees rather than family members to make decisions about my welfare. My new will reflected the dramatic shift in my relationships with my children. Instead of inheriting the bulk of my estate, Rebecca and Michael would each receive a modest sum that acknowledged their status as my children, without rewarding their abusive behavior. The majority of my assets would fund a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting elderly people facing financial exploitation from their family. The foundation would be named the David and Margaret Richardson Foundation for Elder Justice, honoring both my late husband's memory and my own experience surviving family abuse. It would provide legal assistance to seniors facing guardianship challenges, fund safe housing for elderly people escaping exploitative situations, and support research into the prevention and prosecution of elder abuse. Creating this foundation felt like transforming my personal trauma into a force for protecting others who might face similar situations. The money that Rebecca and Michael had been so eager to inherit would instead serve people who understood the value of autonomy and dignity in age. Their greed would inadvertently fund the very cause they had violated through their treatment of me. The delivery of the cease and desist letters triggered immediate and revealing responses from both children. Rebecca called within hours of receiving her letter, alternating between rage and tears as she accused me of being manipulated by predatory lawyers who were stealing her inheritance. She claimed that Patricia Williams had brainwashed me against my own family and was orchestrating a scheme to isolate me from people who truly loved me. When I calmly explained that the legal actions were entirely my decision and reflected my response to months of harassment and manipulation, Rebecca's facade of victimhood crumbled completely. She screamed at me over the phone, calling me selfish, vindictive, and mentally ill. She threatened to contest any changes to my estate planning, claiming that I was not competent to make such decisions under the influence of outside manipulation. Most tellingly, Rebecca revealed that she and Michael had already been in contact with real estate agents about listing my property once they gained control over my affair. She had been so confident of success in their guardianship plans that she had begun planning the sale of my home before even filing legal papers. Her assumption that my house was already essentially hers demonstrated the depth of her sense of entitlement to my asset. Michael's response was more calculated, but equally revealing. He arrived at my house the day after receiving his cease and desist letter, bringing flowers and a conciliatory smile that fooled no one. He attempted to frame the legal action as a misunderstanding, claiming that their concerns about my welfare had been misinterpreted as something more sinister. Michael suggested that we could resolve everything through family mediation, avoiding the need for lawyers and legal proceedings that would only enrich outsiders at our family's expense. He spoke about the importance of keeping family matters private, about healing the rifts that had developed between us, and about finding solutions that would protect everyone's interests. But his conciliatory words were undermined by subtle threats woven throughout his presentation. He mentioned how difficult guardianship proceedings could be for elderly people, how stressful court battles might affect my health, and how expensive legal fees could deplete the very assets we were supposedly fighting over. He was offering to stop the harassment in exchange for my surrender to their original demands. When I refused his offer of mediation and reiterated my intention to proceed with the protective legal measures Patricia had recommended, Michael's mask slipped just as completely as Rebecca's had. He accused me of destroying our family over money, of choosing strangers over my own children, and of betraying the values he claimed I had taught him about family loyalty. The irony of his accusations was staggering. Michael was claiming that I was choosing money over family while simultaneously threatening to pursue guardianship in order to gain control over my assets. He was accusing me of betraying family values, while engaging in a coordinated campaign to manipulate and exploit me. The projection was so complete that I wondered if he actually believed his own contradictory statements. Both children seemed genuinely shocked that I was capable of mounting an effective defense against their manipulation. They had apparently assumed that my age and their status as my children would prevent me from seeking outside help or taking decisive action to protect myself. Their surprise at my competence and determination revealed how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that I was the helpless victim they needed me to be. The next few weeks brought a series of increasingly desperate attempts by Rebecca and Michael to salvage their plan. They contacted my doctors directly, claiming to be concerned about my mental state and requesting information about my medical condition. They were informed that patient confidentiality prevented any discussion of my care without my explicit consent, and that their previous attempts to arrange unauthorized evaluations had already been noted in my medical record. They also attempted to rally support from other family members, painting themselves as devoted children trying to protect a mother who had fallen under the influence of manipulative professionals. However, their campaign backfired when several relatives contacted me directly to ask about the situation, giving me the opportunity to explain what was actually happening and to share documentation of their harassment. My cousin Helen, who lived in Portland and had maintained regular contact with me over the years, was particularly supportive. She had observed Rebecca and Michael's behavior at family gatherings, and had always found their treatment of me to be somewhat patronizing and dismissive. When she learned about their guardianship threats and manipulation campaign, she offered to serve as a character witness if legal proceedings became necessary. Helen also helped me understand that Rebecca and Michael's behavior was part of a larger pattern that extended back many years. She reminded me of instances where they had made decisions about family events without consulting me, had spoken about my opinions as though they were irrelevant, and had generally treated me as a burden rather than a valued family member. Their current campaign was not an aberration, but an escalation of long-standing disrespectful attitude. This perspective helped me recognize that I was not overreacting to a temporary family crisis, but finally responding appropriately to chronic mistreatment that I had previously minimized or ignored. The guilt I had felt about taking legal action against my own children began to dissipate as I understood that they had forfeited their right to familial consideration through their sustained campaign of abuse and exploitation. The turning point came when Rebecca made a fatal miscalculation in her desperation to regain control over the situation. She contacted Adult Protective Services, filing a report claiming that I was being financially exploited by my attorney, and was no longer capable of making sound decisions about my welfare. She provided a detailed but largely fabricated account of my supposed cognitive decline, my vulnerability to manipulation, and my need for immediate intervention. Rebecca apparently believed that an official investigation would validate her concerns and provide the documentation needed for guardianship proceedings. Instead, her false report triggered a thorough investigation that exposed the reality of our family situation and provided official documentation of her own abusive behavior. The APS caseworker assigned to investigate Rebecca's allegations was Linda Chen, an experienced professional who specialized in complex elder abuse cases. Linda had seen every variation of family manipulation and financial exploitation during her career, and she recognized the red flags in Rebecca's report immediately. The overly detailed descriptions of my supposed symptoms, the convenient timing of my alleged decline, and the obvious financial motivations underlying the complaints raised serious questions about the reporter's credibility. Linda's initial interview with me took place at my home, where she could observe my living situation and mental state directly. She found my house to be clean, well-maintained, and organized with no signs of self-neglect or confusion. My responses to her questions were coherent, detailed, and consistent with someone who had full command of her mental faculties. More importantly, Linda discovered the extensive documentation I had compiled of Rebecca and Michael's harassment camp, the threatening phone calls, manipulation attempts, false medical reports, and character assassination efforts painted a clear picture of systematic elder abuse perpetrated by my own children. The evidence was so compelling that Linda shifted her investigation from my supposed vulnerability to their documented misconduct. Linda interviewed my neighbors, medical providers, and other contacts that Rebecca had claimed were concerned about my welfare. Instead of finding witnesses to my decline, she discovered people who were confused by Rebecca's allegations and described me as competent, independent, and unchanged from their previous interactions with me. Several neighbors specifically mentioned that Rebecca had visited them asking leading questions about my behavior, which they had found inappropriate and concerning. The investigation culminated in Linda's official report, which completely exonerated me of any competency concerns while documenting substantial evidence of financial exploitation attempts by my adult children. The report noted that Rebecca's allegations appeared to be false and potentially motivated by her desire to gain control over my assets, rather than genuine concern for my welfare. Most significantly, Linda's report triggered a criminal investigation by the Oregon Attorney General's office, which had recently established a specialized unit for prosecuting elder abuse cases. The false APS report, combined with the documented harassment and manipulation campaign, provided grounds for criminal charges against both Rebecca and Michael under Oregon's elder abuse statute. The knowledge that my children were facing potential criminal prosecution for their treatment of me should have brought satisfaction, but instead I felt a profound sadness about how completely our family relationships had deteriorated. These were the people I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for, now facing legal consequences for trying to exploit and control me in my later years. However, my sadness was tempered by relief that their campaign had finally been exposed and stopped. The official validation of my competence and their misconduct removed any remaining doubt about who was the victim and who were the perpetrators in our family drama. I was not a confused elderly woman in need of protection. I was a competent adult who had successfully defended herself against systematic abuse. The completion of my estate planning provided additional protection and peace of mind. The irrevocable trust was finalized, transferring my house and major assets beyond the reach of any future legal challenges. My new will was executed with appropriate witnesses and documentation to prevent any claims of incompetence or undue influence. The charitable foundation was established with initial funding and a board of directors who shared my commitment to elder justice. The foundation's first initiative was to create a legal defense fund for elderly people facing groundless guardianship proceedings. Too many seniors lacked the resources to hire competent attorneys when their families challenged their competence, leaving them vulnerable to losing their autonomy even when they were perfectly capable of managing their own affairs. The foundation would level the playing field by providing access to experienced legal representation. Patricia Williams agreed to serve on the foundation's board and to help develop protocols for identifying and assisting elderly people facing family exploitation. Her decades of experience in elder law would be invaluable in creating effective interventions and preventive measures. She was particularly interested in developing educational materials that would help seniors recognize the early warning signs of financial manipulation by family members. As word of my situation spread through the legal and social service communities, I began receiving calls from other elderly people who were facing similar challenges with their adult children. Many of their stories followed depressingly familiar patterns: children who claimed concern while pursuing control, families who questioned competence when their financial expectations were not met, and elderly parents who doubted their own perceptions when confronted with systematic manipulation. These conversations reinforced my decision to redirect my legacy toward protecting others rather than rewarding the children who had betrayed my trust. Every dollar that might have gone to Rebecca and Michael would instead fund services for people who understood the true value of autonomy and dignity in aging. Their greed had inadvertently created a powerful force for justice that would outlast all of us. The criminal investigation of my children proceeded slowly but steadily. The prosecutor assigned to the case explained that elder abuse prosecutions required careful documentation and preparation, particularly when the perpetrators were family members who could claim to have been acting out of love rather than greed. However, the evidence in my case was unusually strong, including recorded phone calls, written communications, and witness testimony that clearly established the manipulative and exploitative nature of their behavior. Rebecca and Michael hired separate attorneys and attempted to portray their actions as misguided concern rather than criminal exploitation. They claimed to have genuinely believed that I was declining mentally and that their intervention was necessary to protect my welfare. However, their own communications contradicted these claims, revealing their focus on financial gain rather than my well-being. The prosecution's case was strengthened by expert testimony about elder abuse tactics and the psychological impact of family manipulation on elderly victims. Dr. Patricia Santos, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations, testified that the tactics used by my children were consistent with systematic financial exploitation disguised as caregiving. She explained how abusers often used false claims of cognitive decline to justify taking control over their victims' assets and decisions. Most damaging to their defense was the evidence of their premature planning for asset distribution, including Rebecca's contacts with real estate agents and Michael's research into inheritance tax strategy. These actions demonstrated that their concern was primarily financial rather than medical, undermining their claims of acting in my best interests. The trial became a local news story that highlighted the growing problem of elder abuse by family members. The media coverage brought additional attention to the foundation and its mission, resulting in donations and volunteer offers from people who had witnessed similar situations in their own family. The public response confirmed that my experience was not unique but part of a widespread pattern of exploitation that needed sustained attention and resources. Rebecca and Michael were ultimately convicted of elder abuse and financial exploitation, receiving sentences that included substantial fines, community service, and mandatory counseling about elder rights and family relationships. The judge noted that their betrayal of familial trust made their crimes particularly serious and that their actions had caused psychological harm that extended far beyond any financial impact. More importantly to me, the convictions established a legal precedent that would make it easier to prosecute similar cases in the future. The judge's findings about the tactics used by my children would serve as a reference for other courts dealing with family-based elder abuse, potentially protecting other seniors from experiencing what I had endured. The completion of the legal proceedings allowed me to finally move forward with rebuilding my life on my own terms. The stress and uncertainty of the past year had taken a toll on my health and emotional well-being, but the resolution brought a sense of closure that enabled me to focus on positive activities and relationships rather than defensive preparation. I began volunteering with local organizations that served elderly people, sharing my experience and helping others recognize the warning signs of family manipulation. My story resonated with many seniors who had experienced similar pressures from adult children or who were concerned about protecting themselves from future exploitation. The foundation provided a framework for organizing these efforts and amplifying our collective voice. The house that had been the center of so much conflict became a source of joy again, without the constant threat of forced displacement. I could appreciate its beauty and comfort without anxiety. I made improvements that enhanced my enjoyment of the space, including a garden renovation that had been delayed during the crisis and technology updates that made daily life more convenient. Most importantly, I reconnected with friends and family members who had been alienated by Rebecca and Michael's manipulation campaign. Many people who had been told that I was declining mentally were relieved to discover that these reports were false, and they welcomed the opportunity to resume normal relationships. The social isolation that my children had tried to create was replaced by a rich network of supportive connection. My relationship with my grandchildren required careful navigation, as they had been exposed to their parents' version of events without understanding the full context. I chose to maintain contact with them while being honest about the situation in age-appropriate ways. I wanted them to understand that family relationships should be based on mutual respect rather than financial expectations, and that they should never accept manipulation disguised as love. The foundation grew beyond my initial expectations, attracting support from legal professionals, healthcare providers, and community organizations that recognized the urgent need for elder abuse prevention and intervention services. We developed educational programs for seniors, training materials for professionals, and advocacy initiatives that addressed systemic issues in the legal and social service system. One of our most successful programs was a peer support network that connected elderly people who had experienced family exploitation with others who had survived similar situations. These connections provided emotional support that professional counseling could not duplicate, as participants shared strategies for healing and moving forward with people who truly understood their experience. The foundation also funded research into the long-term impacts of elder abuse and the most effective interventions for preventing and addressing family-based financial exploitation. This research contributed to policy discussions about guardianship reform, elder rights protection, and criminal justice responses to elder abuse cases. As the first anniversary of my legal victory approached, I reflected on the profound changes that had occurred in my life. I had transformed from a victim of family manipulation into an advocate for elder justice, from someone who doubted her own perceptions into someone who trusted her judgment completely, and from a person who prioritized family harmony over personal dignity into someone who understood that real love requires mutual respect. The financial cost of defending myself had been substantial, but the foundation's work ensured that those resources would continue protecting other elderly people long after my personal situation was resolved. The money that Rebecca and Michael had been so eager to inherit was instead funding services that embodied the values they had abandoned in their pursuit of wealth. My daily life settled into a rhythm that balanced solitude with community engagement, personal interests with advocacy work, and practical concerns with meaningful activity. I had learned to value my own company without becoming isolated, to trust professional relationships without becoming dependent, and to maintain family connections without accepting abuse. The peace I had found was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of authentic relationships and purposeful activities. I no longer needed to manage other people's expectations or accommodate their demands at the expense of my own well-being. The freedom to make choices based on my own values and preferences rather than family pressure was liberating in ways I had never anticipated. Rebecca and Michael occasionally attempted to re-establish contact, usually around holidays or family events when their absence from my life became most apparent to others. Their communications typically focused on their regret about how things had developed and their desire to rebuild our relationship, but they continued to avoid taking responsibility for their actions or acknowledging the harm they had caused. I responded to these overtures with polite but firm boundaries, making it clear that any future relationship would require genuine accountability and sustained behavioral change rather than superficial apology. I was willing to consider reconciliation if they demonstrated real understanding of their misconduct and commitment to treating me with respect, but I would not sacrifice my peace of mind for the appearance of family unity. The foundation became my primary legacy, ensuring that my experience would benefit others facing similar challenges long after I was gone. The board of directors included legal professionals, healthcare providers, and elder abuse survivors, who shared a commitment to protecting the autonomy and dignity of aging people. Their diverse perspectives and expertise would guide the foundation's work through changing circumstances and emerging challenges. Looking back on the crisis that had initially seemed so threatening, I realized that my children's attempts to control me had actually freed me from limitations I had imposed on myself. Their challenge to my competence had forced me to document and defend my capabilities, revealing strengths I had forgotten I possessed. Their threats to my independence had motivated me to create stronger protections than I had ever considered necessary. Most importantly, their betrayal had taught me that family relationships must be earned and maintained through mutual respect rather than assumed based on biological connection. The people who truly cared about my well-being supported my autonomy even when they disagreed with my choices, while those who claimed to love me but tried to control me revealed their true priorities through their actions. The house that sits on the land David and I chose together remains my home, but it no longer represents the sum total of my worth or identity. I am not just a collection of assets to be managed or inherited, but a complete person with valid preferences, meaningful relationships, and important contributions to make. The The foundation ensures that this understanding will continue protecting other elderly people who might otherwise doubt their own value when faced with family manipulation. Sometimes I sit in the garden David helped me plant and think about the different paths my life might have taken if I had submitted to my children's demand. I might have spent my remaining years in assisted living, watching my assets disappear into someone else's plans while accepting their version of what was best for me. Instead, I choose my own activities, manage my own affairs, and direct my resources toward causes that reflect my values rather than other people's expectations. The transformation from victim to advocate, from doubt to confidence, from isolation to community engagement has been the most important journey of my later years. I discovered that aging does not require surrendering agency, that family relationships can be redefined on healthier terms, and that personal trauma can become a source of strength for helping others facing similar challenges. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.